Usually medical diagnoses are, they're reassuringly precise.
Right.
Like a broken bone shows up as this crisp, jagged white line on an X-ray.
Exactly. It's undeniable.
Right. The doctor points to it, you slap a cast on it, and boom, the problem is solved. It's visible. It's totally binary.
But then you try to look at the human mind.
Yes. What happens when you try to point that exact same diagnostic lens at the mind? You step into the architecture of thought, and suddenly that X-ray machine is completely useless.
Yeah, you're looking at a landscape that is invisible, entirely subjective, and honestly notoriously muddy.
So true. So for everyone listening today, we are looking at a century-old experiment that basically set out to build the very first psychological X-ray machine. We're doing a deep dive into how the simple act of hearing a word and saying the absolute first thing that pops into your head proves that our deepest secrets leak out through our everyday words.
Whether we want them to or not.
Exactly. So where are we starting with this?
Well, we are dissecting a truly foundational text today. It's called The Associations of Normal Subjects by C.G. Jung and Franz Riklin.
Jung, like the Carl Jung.
The very same. And to really grasp why this was so revolutionary, you have to, picture the setting. It's the early 1900s at the Burgholzli Psychiatric Clinic in Switzerland, working under Professor Eugen Bleuler.
Right.
And they were actively trying to study the chaotic, fractured thoughts of psychotic patients. But they hit this massive conceptual wall.
Because they realized they had absolutely no scientific baseline for what a quote-unquote normal mind even looked like.
Exactly. Which is a pretty fundamental oversight when you think about it.
Right. I mean, you can't possibly measure how far someone's thought process has deviated from the norm if you haven't even defined the norm to begin with.
Precisely the problem.
Yeah.
They needed a map of standard human cognition. They needed to understand the invisible rules that govern our spontaneous, everyday thoughts before they could treat the abnormal ones.
Makes sense.
And what they uncovered in that quest for a baseline ended up revealing, well, a lot. Like how simple distractions totally alter our brain's wiring and how our families silently pass down psychological frameworks.
Which is wild.
And how hidden emotions can just completely hijack our biology.
Okay, so to build that map, they had to design a very specific kind of trap for the mind. And the methodology they came up with was incredibly strict. I mean, especially for that era.
Oh, absolutely rigorous.
Yeah. So they brought in 38 individuals, which is this very deliberate cross-section of society. They had highly educated professionals, completely uneducated laborers, men, women, basically ranging in age from 20 to 50.
A really solid sample size for an in-depth qualitative study back then.
Right. And the setup was beautifully simple, but honestly so intense. The researcher would sit directly across from the subject with a stopwatch, and the stopwatch measured down to 1/5 of a second.
Just picture the tension of that.
Oh, I'd be sweating immediately.
Yeah. Someone just staring at you, a stopwatch ticking loudly, just waiting for your brain to produce a completely involuntary reaction.
They would read from a list of 400 everyday stimulus words. So nouns, adjectives, verbs, and the subject just had to reply with the very first word that entered their head as fast as humanly possible.
But they ran into a massive hurdle right out of the gate, didn't they?
They did, and it wasn't even psychological, it was linguistic. Because this was Switzerland, the uneducated subjects spoke Swiss German, which the text points out is an acoustic motor dialect.
Right. It's a language that is lived and spoken.
Yeah, but almost never read or written. Okay, let's unpack this, because it's like asking someone who only knows how to play the guitar by ear to suddenly take a test reading sheet music on the spot. They freeze up. Not because they don't know music, but because the format itself is super intimidating.
What's fascinating here is that distinction changes everything about how a brain interacts with the test. Because all formal education, all printed materials, all official interactions with doctors at that time were conducted in standard German.
Right, the power dynamic.
Exactly. Because of that power dynamic and that really stark linguistic divide, the uneducated subjects didn't treat this as a simple reflex game. They approached the experiment with this rigid, almost fearful schoolroom attitude.
Like they were taking a final exam.
Yes. They were desperately trying to translate their natural flowing dialect thoughts into the quote-unquote correct standard German just to appease these clinical doctors.
And it proves that language is never just a passive tool we use to broadcast our thoughts, right? The language itself fundamentally shapes the cognitive environment.
Completely. The uneducated subjects overwhelmingly interpreted this word association exercise as a literal question and answer test.
Yeah.
So if the doctor said the word house, the subject wouldn't just blurt out a random association like brick or big.
Right.
They would actively try to solve a puzzle, offering a word like house cat. They were trying to define the word or complete it.
Which shows how the social context of feeling tested forces the brain to perform rather than just react. But wait, if people are altering their answers just because they feel intimidated by the doctors, how did Jung and Riklin ever figure out what was a genuine emotional thought and what was just like a linguistic reflex? I mean, they must have had thousands of words to sort through.
Oh, they did. And they needed a really rigorous filing system to make sense of all that chaos. So they applied something called the Kraepelin-Aschaffenburg classification schema.
The Kraepelin-Aschaffenburg, wow, say that 3 times fast.
I know, the terminology sounds incredibly dense. But the core concept is actually brilliant. They divided every single reaction into 2 main buckets: internal associations and external associations.
Okay, let's break those buckets down because this is where the architecture of the mind really starts to show for the listener. An internal association is a reaction driven by deep semantic meaning, right?
Right. It's about the core concept.
So if the stimulus word is snake and you reply poisonous, or I say father and you say good, you are actively digging into the conceptual core of what that thing actually represents in the world.
Exactly. You're actually spending computational power in your brain to evaluate the concept. An external association, conversely, bypasses that deep meaning entirely.
It's just surface level.
Yeah, it
Wow.
relies on coexistence in the real world or sheer habit, or sometimes just the sound of the word. So responding to table with chair, or ink to pen,
Just obvious pairs.
right? Or simply spitting back linguistic opposites like dark to light. These are deeply grooved, superficial verbal reflexes. They really don't require you to actually picture a table or ponder the philosophical nature of darkness. You just fire back the habitual pair.
Now, this is the part of the data that completely threw me because it feels entirely backwards. When they looked at who was giving which type of answer, they discovered this thing called the attitude phenomenon.
Oh, this is a great finding.
Right. The data showed that the highly educated, well-read subjects, the doctors, the professors taking the test, they were producing the most blunted, superficial, external associations. They heavily relied on wordplay and sounds. But wait a minute. Shouldn't highly educated, well-read people give the most deep, profound internal associations?
I mean, it sounds like a paradox until you really examine the defense mechanisms of an intellectual mind. What the educated subjects did was effectively gamify the experiment.
Gamify it.
Yeah, because they possess such high verbal facility, they could effortlessly strip the stimulus word of its actual meaning and treat it purely as a linguistic puzzle.
Meaning they didn't even bother picturing the object in their mind's eye. If the doctor said wonder, the subject didn't think about, the profound emotion of awe. They just grabbed the phonetic sound and snapped back scuffle to make wonderful.
That is exactly the mechanism. By over-intellectualizing the task, their cognitive processing became completely mechanical. And honestly, it's a way to protect the ego.
Oh, interesting.
Think about it. If you engage with the deep internal meaning of every single word a psychiatrist throws at you, you risk exposing your actual feelings.
Right. You might reveal something personal.
Exactly. But if you treat it as a sterile game of linguistic ping pong, just batting sounds back and forth, you stay totally safe. You take the path of absolute least resistance.
Which raises a really fascinating question. If a highly educated brain naturally builds these superficial defenses just by treating the test like a game, could you force the opposite? Like, could you break a person's concentration so thoroughly that their defenses just collapse and you see what's underneath?
That exact question led the researchers to design the distraction experiments. They wanted to observe the mind when the focus of consciousness is deliberately sabotaged.
Sabotaged how?
To do this, they forced 2 different types of cognitive overload. First, they introduced internal distraction by making subjects focus on what they call the A phenomenon.
Okay, the A phenomenon. This is essentially forced visualization, right? They would tell a subject, hey, when I say the word singing, you have to hold a vivid mental picture of an opera stage in your mind. And while holding that image, you have to spit out your reaction word.
It's incredibly difficult. It basically eats up all the brain's available RAM. And then they tested external distraction. They literally sat the subject next to a ticking metronome and gave them a pencil. They had to make a pencil mark exactly in time with the beat. First, 50 words tested at a manageable 60 beats per minute, and then another 50 words tested at a frantic 100 beats per minute.
Multitasking a physical rhythm game while trying to verbally associate random words sounds absolutely exhausting. I would fail instantly.
And that exhaustion is exactly what they were measuring. The results were universally revealing. When the brain's attention drops, whether it's due to the metronome, the forced visualization, or even just natural evening fatigue and morning drowsiness, which they also tracked, by the way.
Oh, they tracked time of day, too.
Yes, and they found that when you're tired, the mind's associations violently blunt. They devolve into purely primitive sound reactions.
So people literally stop caring about what words mean and just start rhyming. Like the word leave triggers grieve, king becomes ring. So what does this all mean? It's like cognitive autocorrect. When you're too tired or distracted to steer your thoughts, the brain just takes the path of least resistance, rhyming or repeating words like a robot.
Exactly. Think of directed attention as a gatekeeper. Normally, your conscious mind demands meaning. It actively inhibits those primitive babbling sound associations from coming out of your mouth.
Right.
But when you occupy that gatekeeper with a metronome or a vivid mental image, the gate just swings open. The primitive acoustic mind leaks out because the sheer energy required to forge an internal, meaningful connection just isn't available anymore.
I am definitely going to use my cognitive gatekeepers as an excuse the next time I'm tired and making terrible puns. But, while distraction turned most of these subjects into rhyming machines, the researchers noticed this one huge anomaly.
Oh, this is my favorite part of the study.
Some people were completely immune to this blunting. No matter what the researchers did, their answers remained intensely, unavoidably personal. And this led them to discover what they called the predicate type.
The data on the predicate type is just astonishing.
Yeah.
If you isolate the files for subjects 6, 7, and 8, this glaring pattern emerges. This was a family unit, a mother and her 2 adult daughters.
Okay.
And instead of ever offering objective facts or external wordplay, their reactions were entirely composed of highly charged, subjective value judgments.
They couldn't separate themselves from the objects at all. Instead of pairing piano with instrument, they would say piano and horrible, or water and wonderful, pupil and boring. Up to 40% of their total reactions were totally egocentric. They were the center of every single word.
They weren't describing a shared objective reality. They were broadcasting their emotional relationship to reality. And the researchers quickly realized this wasn't just an isolated quirk. They looked at subject 4, a sister in an entirely different family. She exhibited vivid synesthesia. She literally experienced the letter U as the color yellow and the letter E as red.
Which is fascinating on its own.
Definitely. But when they tested her mother and sister, they found the exact same hyper-specific sound-based reaction profile. This highly subjective, emotional way of processing the world appeared to be a familial disposition.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Think about the implications of that for a second. We all know we inherit physical traits from our parents, right? Like you get your dad's nose or your mom's eyes. We know we pick up their habits and their opinions. But are we literally inheriting our way of connecting words, our very framework of judging the world from our parents?
This raises an important question about the blending of nature and nurture. The data suggests that we don't just inherit physical traits. We might inherit a specific psychological lens for processing reality. If you are raised by a mother who unconsciously filters every single noun and verb through a lens of subjective emotional value, you aren't just memorizing her vocabulary. You are being actively trained in her specific associative architecture. You learn how to connect concept A to concept B using her blueprints.
It's inheriting the machinery of thought itself. That is so cool. Now, we've seen how families share these mental frameworks, but what happens when an individual is carrying a massive, devastating secret that they are actively trying to hide from the world?
Yes.
Because this brings us to the most dramatic finding of the entire study, how the unconscious mind seizes control of the physical body.
To understand this phenomenon, we really have to define the concept of the complex. Jung and Riklin map this out beautifully. A complex is a strongly feeling-toned constellation of ideas.
Okay, what does that mean in plain English?
It's a web of thoughts bound together by a powerful, usually repressed emotion that constantly threatens to dominate consciousness.
It acts like a gravitational black hole inside your memory. You might be having a totally normal conversation, but if a word gets too close to the edge of that complex, it just gets sucked into the emotional vortex.
That's a perfect analogy. And we see this vortex capture someone in real time with subject 19.
Yes, subject 19.
Imagine one of the young physicians working in the hospital. He's 25 years old, raised in an incredibly strict Christian environment. He sits down to take this word association test, presumably thinking it's just a routine clinical exercise.
Right.
But he is harboring a secret. He is deeply, forbiddenly in love with a Jewish woman named Alice Stern.
The stakes for him are incredibly high. A romance like that in his social and professional circle at that time would have been absolutely explosive. So he's sitting there, stopwatch is ticking, and the doctors are just throwing random words at him.
And his hidden complex completely dismantles his ability to take the test. The stimulus word wedding is red. His reaction is misfortune.
Oh.
Yeah. The stimulus word is to kiss. His immediate reaction is never. And then, the ultimate slip. The doctor reads the word in. His reaction is the star,
Welsh.
which, translated into German, is Stern. Alice Stern.
He practically shouted her name at his colleagues. And it wasn't just individual words. The complex actually hijacked his vocabulary. When they gave him the stimulus word game, the stopwatch kept ticking. He delayed for a really long time and finally replied with a full sentence. "Sweet games will I play with you."
Yeah.
That isn't a normal association. That is a direct poetic fragment from Goethe's Erlkönig.
Which perfectly illustrates the sheer biological power of the complex. The emotional tone attached to his secret love was so immense that it bypassed his everyday vocabulary entirely. It reached down and accessed deeply buried poetic fragments just to express an emotion that a single word couldn't hold.
That's incredible.
The researchers also noted frequent failures with this subject.
What's a failure in this context?
It's a moment where a word hit so close to the complex that he simply blanked out. His mind froze, and he gave no reaction at all because the emotional roadblock was too large to navigate.
But wait a minute, let's look at this objectively. If this guy was so smart, I mean, he's a trained physician. He knows how the mind works. He knows the doctors are recording his answers. If the word wedding comes up, couldn't he just consciously choose a boring word like cake or dress to hide his secret romance? Why let misfortune slip out?
Because you simply cannot outsmart your own nervous system. The reaction to the stimulus word is innervated.
Innervated.
Meaning the electrical signal is triggered in the body before the subject fully processes the word in their conscious mind.
Oh, wow.
The complex lives in the unconscious, and the unconscious moves infinitely faster than logic. By the time he realizes the word wedding is dangerous, his body has already prepared the word misfortune. To stop it requires a massive, sudden application of mental brakes, which results in those long stopwatch delays, the poetic outbursts, or complete silence.
Your secrets are quite literally faster than your lies. That is both chilling and profoundly fascinating.
It really proves that the architecture of the mind is always revealing its blueprints, provided you have the right tools to read them.
We started today by trying to map the baseline of a normal mind. Along the way, we discovered how the language we speak and the education we receive can accidentally train us to think superficially. We watched a simple ticking metronome drain the brain's power until it was reduced to primitive rhyming.
Right.
We saw how a mother's subjective worldview can be hardwired into her children's brains. And finally, we watched a stopwatch expose a forbidden romance hiding in plain sight.
The sheer density of information happening in a fraction of a second is just staggering.
It really is. The next time you, the listener, are bantering with a friend, playing a quick word game, or even sending a rapid text message, pay very close attention to what naturally spills out of you.
Oh, definitely.
You might think you're just making idle conversation, but your brain is actively broadcasting its deepest wiring, your current level of mental fatigue, and perhaps even the complexes you think you've buried perfectly.
That's all right there on the surface.
Which leaves us with a final thought to chew on. If our unconscious emotional complexes so completely dictate our split-second reactions to simple vocabulary words, how much of our complex, everyday, quote-unquote, rational decision-making, who we choose to hire, what we impulsively buy, or who we decide to date is actually just an elaborate logical rationalization of those hidden emotional word webs already spinning in the dark? Think about that the next time you assume your choices are perfectly clean and objective.